Hello everyone. Today I want to do something a little bit different and talk a little bit about lines. Specifically if you're starting out and you're just getting into drawing. Lines are sort of the basic tool that we all use as artists to sort of define our stuff. Even when people paint, a lot of times they draft it first in lines. And so today I just wanted to kind of go over lines, how they work, what they are, and give you something to think about, when you're drawing and how you're sort of composing your stuff together. So I've got a couple things to go through. Let's jump right into it. So all lines have a couple of things. So there are different attributes to a line, right? And these are sort of what you control in order to get the visual information you're trying to convey, whether it's a building or a person or a hand or whatever it is. These are essentially the tools that are in your toolkit. So the first being thickness. You can have very thin, light lines, or you can have very thick lines. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those sort of mean later and what they can mean to a viewer. But you can also, of course, control the length of your line. It can be thick or thin all along the length, or it could be a short little line. You can, of course, also control the shape. You can have very curvy lines. Really, you could also have very straight lines. You could also have lines that zigzag. And this one, this next one here, texture, this is actually more something that, unless you're digital, probably not an issue, because the texture of your line or your pen or whatever in the real world will just be the texture of the pen. You can't really change it so much. There might be some clever ways, you can change a little bit by turning it on its side. You get like a thicker line or thinner line. But the texture overall is going to be the same. But in digital, these are actually two different textures for different pens that I have in this program. This first one is, you can see over here in the corner that I'm using this Real G pen. And it has blown up when it's really, really big. It looks like this. Which is, kind of how pens actually work. They're not, nothing is a perfect circle in the real world, so it has little jags and stuff. The reason that this is kind of a nice thing in digital is if you're struggling with digital art, and your stuff is looking too smooth, like it feels very digital. Probably know what I'm talking about for those of you who do digital work or have seen a lot of digital work. If it's feeling digital, you're probably suffering from your pen or instrument, the brush that you're using, not having texture. Because on the other spectrum, and this is up here, the G pen, this is an example of the G pen, this one right here, is a perfect circle. And so doing lines with that makes them look very digital. And actually all of these lines that I used, these are all using this Real G. In fact, if you zoom in, you can see all of those little bumps and things popping out of it. Even when I do like the small ones, you can see that there's these like little spots where it's lighter or darker. That's because it makes it look more rough. And if you ever scan a piece of paper and look at your pencil marks, they're going to look a lot more like this. Whereas if I go to the Real G pen, let me get something a little bit smaller, and I make a line, you can see just how smooth that is. You will never see this kind of line if you zoom in, like if you scan something and then zoom into it on paper. Reason for that being, paper has a texture, has little bumps. It's made out of wood, so has little bumps and things where all the fibers knit together. And then your pencil itself has its own little sort of micro texture, which will cause it to bump around and things. So the other things that you can control with your lines are things like the proximity, which is just how close the lines are to one another. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more in practice later. But if they're closer together, right, you can control that. So when you sort of combine these things, and I'll show a couple more examples of this, that's what we use to create different objects and things that we're essentially cheating people into seeing what we want them to see. So right here we have some little short lines. Go back to my real G pen, I like it better. So here we have some really short lines that I use to sort of create this eyebrow shape. Don't have any super long lines, but you could say that on the inside of the eyelid, this here, it's kind of a long line, at least for the eye. We have this sort of thick line here to thin, which is the nose, the bridge of the nose. And here we have some thin lines, and then we also have some thin lines here for like the bottom of the eyelid. Also some short sort of sweeping lines for that. I don't really have any jagged lines because it's mostly organic stuff, doesn't tend to be jagged, but you could say that that's like a little jagged line there using the shape. And it's sort of how you combine these that creates a language for other people's brains to understand and interpret as whatever it is you're trying to convey. So before I jump into sort of the more detailed use of these, there are some practices you can do just to sort of get used to controlling at least some of these things. Thickness is really just a function of how hard you push down, and that's something that you can kind of practice as you're doing other things. You can press really hard and then let up, and then press really hard and let up, and just kind of get an idea of what kind of line you're creating. But if you want to practice length or shape, some of the things that you can do for that, for length, the best thing to do is to draw long lines. And so you just set your pen or pencil on the paper and then try to make a straight line if you can. As straight as you can. Doesn't have to be perfect, and it probably won't be the first number of times. This is also just a really good warm-up practice, just to kind of get your muscles in your hands and in your arm and in your shoulder sort of in the groove of what you're going to do. And the way that I do it, some people don't put their hand on the page. I am left-handed, so for right-handed people it might actually be easier to pull it the other way. Or vice versa, kind of depends on the person, but when I'm doing these kinds of lines, I set my pinky on the page, or in my case on the screen in the digital realm, but very lightly, and then most of the pressure, or most of the thing that kind of keeps me anchored, is the tip of the pen or the pencil that I'm using, and then I just pull it. I really try to think of it as pulling the line. You just pull it. And you try to get it as straight as you can. And if you go really fast, you'll notice that like as you come to the end, you'll get these weird bends. That's not what you want. It's sort of a confident, sort of singular stroke to get the kind of lines that you want. And this is just really good practice for... And, of course, you can practice doing your thicknesses, so like single thickness to thicker to thinner. And that might be good, when you get good at doing straight lines. Sort of being able to modulate the thickness as you go can actually be really important. And now for things like shape, to practice doing shapes, for jagged lines and things, it's... There's not really a great practice you can do, just because it's just really just a whole bunch of short lines put together. And even if you wanted to, you can just kind of do it from the wrist. So what I would say is if you want something to practice, making shapes of lines, curves, which the way that I would do this is doing ovals. They don't have to be at different angles because they can be very hard. If you can manage it, you can do them at different angles. I'm not very good at these at that angle because, again, left-handed. But for these, it's different than lines. I actually don't even have my hand on the screen. It's just the tip, and so everything is about the arm control. And these are easier, smaller. They get a little bit more difficult, larger, and what you're trying to do is do the oval, and then actually see, I missed that one. You want to actually complete the oval. So this is a good example, pretty good example. This one's actually turned out okay, although it's a little weird right here. This is a good example. But, you know, for these, not only are they great for warm-ups, but you can fill an entire sketch page with just doing straight lines and ovals. And it's just really good practice. What you're doing is you're teaching your muscles and your brain sort of how to do this without you having to think about it, which will just help your lines overall. And the same thing with this, if you really want, you can try to modulate the thickness. It does make it harder if you're trying to do thick and thin lines at the same time. These also come in handy if you ever advance and start doing perspective work. If you have two-point perspective, you know, a circle doesn't look like a circle when it's sort of at an angle, and that's where sort of these ovals come in. It makes it a little easier to draw those. So that is some just simple practice stuff. Another one that you can do, which we did when I was in college, are these sort of gradient squares. This is more about doing this, practicing this to get used to the idea of proximity and what it actually does. So what I would do is you start off with just some very thin lines, and they're kind of far apart. And then as you go, you get them a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, and then maybe a little bit closer. And then you can get even closer. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll actually start making them thicker, not maybe a ton closer. Keep going. And so what you end up doing is, you know, you start with light and you go to dark. And this is just sort of, and you don't have to do too many of these. It's nice to make them yourselves, though, because then you get used to the idea of what is light, what is dark. You know, you could even add another square on the end here, one that has nothing, and then one that's just, you know, black. And you can also do this, you know, I'm just using just one kind of line, this sort of hatching. But I've also done them where you do cross hatching, which is a little bit harder because this inherently looks darker. There's less white space. But you just go from light to dark using different techniques. You can also do little scribble lines and see how light to dark you can get it. And that's really just kind of, you know, if you see an artist where you really like their technique and you like their shading style, this is really good. I'm not going to talk too much about shading today because we're really just kind of focused on line work and how that works and just sort of building out a character, and shading is a little bit more advanced because you have to look at light and, you know, where that light goes and what's dark or anything like that. But this is still just good practice, just to sort of build out in your mind, like, what does proximity actually mean? You know, what is this thing? Why does it matter? And it matters basically because of this. Because even if you have a character that just has a bunch of lines that you're trying to show, I don't know, part of their bicep or hair on their arm or something like that, you have to understand that those lines are going to come off as dark. And if they're too close, they might come off as too dark. So it's more of like, be aware of it, understand what your lines are doing, and you'll be okay. So, rules for lines and using lines. A lot of this stuff kind of follows, I'm trying to remember his name now, but there was an artist who did a lot of figure drawing, Loomis, that's what it is, did a lot of figure drawing, and they sort of developed some basic rules for how to use lines. And I tried to, in each one of these examples, really only highlight one specific rule, so, and then I'll show an example where I kind of use all of them. But first and foremost, when you draw something like this bone, we'll look at this example first. Things that are on the top, which means if you were to draw a line from the top, kind of the top of the page down, is where it's going to hit. Those lines should typically be lighter. It doesn't mean the thinnest line you can possibly make, because there are other rules, like I said, that you kind of have to use in conjunction with this. But as a basic rule, those should be lighter. Stuff that if you drew a line from the bottom of the page up would touch these should be darker. And the reason for this being is that as people, we kind of look, if you're outside, the sun is typically coming from an upward direction, and the bottom is enshadowed. And so a thicker line, like it or not, lines kind of equal shadow in a way. So by doing that, you weight down the bottom of the object, which makes sense to the brain. Things go down. And so using this method, this is actually a pretty good way that, like, when you're drawing a character or something, lines should be heavier towards the bottom. So this one we already talked about, these two balls over here, where if you spread lines out, it looks lighter, and if you put them closer, it looks darker. Like I said, I didn't really change line weight around it, but if we consider that these are two balls or pucks or whatever they are, this one looks like, this bottom one here looks like this part is in deeper shadow than this one up here. So, general rule. Another one, taking a look at this weird character, and as a note, I am sorry for the rushed anatomy. I was just kind of throwing these out there just so I'd have examples. But when you overlap, the object that is closer should be thicker. So in this case, the arm line here needs to be thicker than the sort of the line that's coming in behind it. Now you'll also notice that as this line passes behind, this little thin one, it thickens up again around the knee and then thins out again as it passes back. Because when I say this overlap sort of rule, it doesn't mean the whole line. It just means the part that it's passing in front of. Things that have thicker lines look like they're closer than things that have thin lines. So, even if I try to match the size of these two circles, this one looks closer, this one looks farther. And even if it's something where you're like, that doesn't seem true, if somebody just glances at your work, it'll be true. So when you overlap these, again, this one's closer, this one looks like it's probably behind it. And it's just a general thing. When things are closer, you should have them be thicker than things that are further back. And again, these are just general rules. There may be times when they don't apply, but in most cases, if you're just starting out, just try following them, and then you'll start to learn when to break them when it doesn't look right to you, or if somebody critiques your work and they're like, maybe that's too thick or too thin, start looking at it then. So for this next one, silhouettes, and this is kind of the last one. This applies mostly to comic booky stuff. I'm not, or cartoons or anything like that. Doesn't necessarily apply to figure drawing all the time, although it can be really helpful. But the silhouette, which is the outside line of a character, should typically be pretty thick. Doesn't necessarily have to be the thickest line on the character, but it should be thicker than your detail lines. And the reason for that is if somebody glances at your work, and this is actually pretty true in video games too. If you watch video game developers, they talk a lot about it. But the first thing that people see is the silhouette of a character. And the more unique that silhouette is, the more interesting it is. So let me erase this out just a little bit here. So technically speaking, that's the silhouette of this character. This part right here, this sort of rib to chest, is a little bit thicker because it's in front of the arm. So you can thicken that up, and that's not necessarily a problem. Okay. So that's kind of it for just general rules of, when do I use thick to thin lines? And really, thick or thin lines are sort of the lifeblood of drawing. You can draw a face using just little tiny lines, and it'd be like, oh, this is a stylistic choice, is what I'm doing. If I do like a creepy skull sort of thing here, just made out of like little tiny lines. Like, you can do that. That's not a problem. You've decided to do that. But you still want to understand thickness and how that's going to read. I will say it's hard to thicken up a whole bunch of tiny little lines because you have to keep going back over them, but it can be done if that's the effect you're trying to achieve. So let's go ahead and take a look at let's kind of put it all together. So I have this character, sort of a generic, street brawler kind of character. And you can probably tell by looking at it, like it looks like it's okay drawn. I didn't spend a huge amount of time on it, but it reads okay. But there are some things about it where you might say, well, the arm's getting a little lost there. So let's see what happens, because right now most of this is in a single line weight. They're all pretty close, right? I've got lines that are about that thick, lines that are maybe that thick. I think I see one that's maybe a little bit thicker. Yep. And then I have some that are super thin. Because like that one's super thin. I'm thinking that's kind of thick. Maybe the thickest one is over here. So that's not a lot of variation from one to the next. So let's turn on another layer here, and I'll show you what happens when I punch it up a little bit. So that's it with added line weight. So I'll go back and forward. Back, forward. So here's kind of what I did. The top, this higher part of the character up here, this is where the light is coming in, right? So sunshiny day. This is where the light's coming in. So if it's coming down, stuff that is closer, like we were saying with the other one, if I draw those vertical lines down, closer to the top, if I draw a line down from the top, it's going to hit it, are thinner in almost every respect. And you do have to think about it in three-dimensional space, but I don't want to get too far into the weeds there on that. The first line it hits is really this mohawk. So this sort of curvature line, technically probably could be a little bit thinner. But the other thing is, as you go deeper towards the bottom, the line should get thicker, just as you move. And so you can see the thickest lines are down here. And not only are they here, but they're also here because that's an overlap, right? The character is overlapping. The arm's overlapping for the rest of the character. So, I'm sort of allowing myself here for this particular part to be a little bit thicker, also because I wanted that design element to stand out. So there are other little calls that you can make, but, kind of here's where I use my lines. So as I mentioned, we'll just start from the top. So short little lines for the hair, because hairstyle that way would be short. Again, sort of thin on the top. This line's a little bit thicker because, again, if you were to come up from the bottom, draw lines from the bottom of the page up, they would hit that as opposed to the part coming from the top. So that can be a little bit thicker. Thin again for the shoulders. And probably just as important is being thin. Oop, I don't know where I lost my color. Being thin for detail lines, because they're not silhouette lines, so those should be thin. As I mentioned, as we get lower on the page, we start getting these thicker lines. Also, there are some long lines in this that I drew for this. I'm sorry, I slowed down talking because I'm concentrating on doing that, but that's another one, if you're practicing your straight lines, it shouldn't be too difficult to start bending them, because bending them is the easy part. It's keeping them straight that's hard. So if you do the harder thing, you'll get better at the easy thing. So again, here are some thin detail lines that were used for the tattoo. I did it in red because it's really just a design element. It doesn't have much to do with the actual lines. But you can see I did use some different patterns and shapes in here. They're sort of triangles, right? I don't know what that pattern's called, but you see it a lot in I don't even say Egyptian. I think it's a Greek thing, where they have these sort of squarish spirals. And then, yes, again, you can see where for the pants, this line is thick and then it thins out, and then this huge outside line for the hand comes in. And that's because of the overlap. This arm is closer than the rest of his body to the viewer, so I had to make sure I account for that. Because again, if you don't, let's turn that off, you can see here it looks a little strange. Like it almost looks like that's closer to you. We know it's not, but it feels strange because the hand doesn't pop out nearly as much as it should. Or even, you know, the separation between this glove and the background, because the glove is overlapping the skin on the hand. So, you know, it should be thicker, and it's not. And then last but not least, I wanted to kind of call this one out. I did not do a giant thick line here. And the reason for that is this sort of little, I don't even know what you call it, little dongle with beads, is not an integral part to the character. And so sometimes it's okay to leave this stuff out a little bit from the line hierarchy, because otherwise you might draw more attention to it than you really wanted to. This is just kind of like an extra little, oh look, he's got a thing hanging off his glove. But it doesn't have any real significance to the drawing itself in a lot of ways. I'm sure there are artists out there who would say, no, you should have done the thing. Should have gone in here, you know, taken some black and really pushed it down, made it as thick as possible. But the problem is, you know, when I make it like that and try to thicken it up, it looks weird. Also because it's hanging behind his arm here. Like this thing probably, if I were to take the lines up, attaches somewhere here. Do this in red so it's a little bit more clear. Attaches in here somewhere if I take those lines up. And because it's in the background, again, the rule of overlap says I can get away with using really thick lines here and thinner lines here. They might be able to be thickened up a little bit, but I don't have to do that. It still reads okay. Now, if there were more stuff back here, like, you know, we put in actual legs or something for this character, something like, I don't think they would be there necessarily, but kneecap and then calf. If I put something like that in where this character is like striding forward, and then I needed to make those stand out, these little beads stand out, then I would want to thicken them up just so that they don't get lost in the noise of whatever pant it is that this character's wearing, or boots, or, you know, whatever else they have on. I realize the anatomy on that's horrible, but that's what I get for eyeballing it. So yeah, so this is sort of the practical application of kind of putting all of that other stuff to practice. So here's just kind of what I would say is, you know, do some practice, stuff. Oop, I don't need all that stuff there. I turned off most of my. Do some practices by just trying to do some, you know, long lines, long straight lines. Train your body to be able to make them without too much effort. Try your little ovals. Trying to get them so that they look like if they were a circle turned sideways, it would be right. So they should be even, which means that that's not a great example because there's kind of a wobble kind of in this area. And then, you know, practice kind of going light to dark, and you can practice it with all different types of lines. If you want to do cross-hatching, you can certainly do that. You'll get darker faster in most cases. And try not to have those little arrowheads. That's kind of a pen control thing when you're trying to do it too fast. But and you know, you can even practice squiggles if you want to try to make it darker and stuff off of just doing squiggles. There are lots of different techniques and uses of line to make things light and dark when you do shading. You know, there's one that's kind of like this. It's an interesting one. It makes things look kind of treaded. I see it a lot for. I used to use it when I did lots of scratch boarding. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful. If you have any comments or anything or questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. And thank you all for spending some time with me. Bye-bye now.